Hello and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 123 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I've got another article to share with you. I had originally planned to have a guest episode today, but the guest was unfortunately unable to make it, but I'm working on rescheduling that, and I'm actually planning to bring some other really interesting guests to the show in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye out for that. But today, since it's a last minute episode and the guest wasn't able to make it, I want to share an article with you from fee.org, which is, of course, the Foundation for Economic Education. And the article is an article by Daniel Kowalski. The article is called "What Charles Ponzi's Scheme and U.S. Entitlement Programs Have in Common." And the subtitle is "The structure of Charles Ponzi's scheme must have impressed the policymakers coming of age in the 1930s because they would use the same structure for the nation's new Social Security system." And this is a comparison that I've heard made before. I've sort of said it in passing, just in conversation, but it's I think a comparison that's worth making and worth keeping in mind because it points out the inherent problem, not only with the creation of these sorts of programs, but with dismantling these sorts of programs, because the voters who have paid into the system over time, even though their money is gone, the government has already spent it, wasted it, etc., they want what they paid in back, because this was supposed to be their savings net, their security net, their retirement, at least when we're talking about Social Security. But with that said, let's get into the article here. Again, it's an article by Daniel Kowalski from fee.org, and of course, I'll link to it in the show notes, as always. He says, "When Charles Ponzi's investment opportunity to sell international postage stamps was exposed to be a scam in 1920, its basic premise would forever be associated with the man's name. A Ponzi scheme promises investors massive returns on an investment that does not really exist. Instead, unknown to everyone but the person or people running it, old investors are paid with money that comes in from new investors. This setup usually goes undetected until the one day when the well of new investors dries up and the money stops flowing in. The structure of Ponzi's scheme must have really impressed the policymakers that were coming to age during this era, because they would use the same setup for the nation's new Social Security system in the 1930s. Starting in 1937, employees and employers needed to fund the system, and in 1940, retirees began to draw benefits. The financial amount of these benefits dwarfed what the first retirees put in during their working careers. This might seem unfair to most of us, but because there were far more people putting into the system than there were taking out, no one seemed to mind very much. Because of the post-war baby boom, Social Security's scheme was able to work and remain financially solvent. While the public was skeptical of the program at its beginning, more and more people became won over by it as they contributed, saw others benefit, and then eventually benefited themselves. It was so popular that the government decided to expand its role as a provider of Social Security benefits by introducing the Medicare system in 1965. There is no doubt that Medicare was an attempt at solving a real problem that most seniors faced in regard to private health insurance. It was very expensive, about 3 times the amount for a younger person. Today's Medicare system consists of 4 parts, but for simplicity, we will focus on Part A, which is funded through payroll taxes like Social Security. And like Social Security, it is not sustainable over the longer term because it is structured like a Ponzi scheme where new money needs to flow in to pay the older folks that are cashing out. Today, there are more medical treatments available than there were 60 years ago. This helps people live longer than before, which also means they are using more of the system than previous generations did. At the same time, there are fewer workers per beneficiary than before, which means more money is flowing out while less money is flowing in. This is the stage of a Ponzi scheme where things are about to fall apart. The flaws with these systems are not new revelations. In fact, the estimates of when the programs will run out of money comes from the programs themselves. Reform is needed, but it's unpalatable for most politicians because the old investors are a large voting bloc, and they want their promised returns even if their own money is gone and someone else will be left being stiffed. Ponzi schemes and federal fiscal policy. America always pays its bills is a slogan that doesn't seem to make much sense when you really think about it. When I receive my water, electric, and gas bills, the amount due is always the current amount, and there are not any past due balances. Once I pay the monthly bill, the amount due always returns to zero. This happens because I always pay my bills, and therefore there is not any debt. Most Americans have credit cards and they help us get by when we are struggling financially, but no responsible lender would raise your limit while you hit it and haven't reduced your balance in any meaningful way. Nor would anyone issue you a new account once they checked your credit rating, as this behavior would result in a low score. The risk is too high that you will default. But somehow these principles fly out the window when it comes to the federal government, which is $31.4 trillion in debt without accounting for unfunded liabilities. Somehow, when they make the claim that they always pay their bills, even though they're paying for it through new debt, is okay. But if your friend tried to do the same thing, you would think that he is a fool. As we approach the deadline for the latest debt ceiling limit in May 2023, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned the public that if the limit was not raised, allowing us to borrow more, then we would not be able to make payments to the old lenders who were owed, and there would have been a default. In other words, the only and absolute way that an old investor was and is going to be paid is if there is a new investor with new money to bring into the system. The funding of our government is a Ponzi scheme. How can it last? Or how long can it last, rather? Even with the deal that suspends the debt ceiling for 2 years, the real problem is just getting kicked down the road without providing any meaningful long-term solutions. The spending will continue to outpace the income, and like Charles Ponzi, Bernie Madoff, and many like them have realized, the house of cards will eventually near a point of collapse. The United States of America is one of the greatest nations to ever rise in the history of civilization. The wealth and industry that was created here until the middle of the 20th century was unprecedented. But the abundance created by previous generations has been taken for granted by those who live in comfortable times. Economically speaking, we are not nearly as strong now as we were then. The only reason it hasn't been unbearable is because the momentum of the past has still been able to sustain us. But once that comes to a stop, we will be on our own. Because if the government's business goes on as usual, then the system is going to collapse. The only thing to hope for now is that there might still be time to change the direction we are heading. All right, so once again, that's an article by Daniel Kowalski at fee.org, and the article is called What Charles Ponzi's Scheme and U.S. Entitlement Programs Have in Common. And of course, it seems obvious, but he's pointing out here that the payments that I'm making today into the Social Security system, that you're making today into the Social Security system, are not going to come back to you later. The government isn't holding that money for you, investing it for you, like you would do if you were going to put it into a retirement account. They are paying it out to current beneficiaries. to people who are currently drawing from the system, because their money has already been taken. And so this is a perpetual system, as the article says, until the politicians have the gumption to stiff somebody, to stiff either current people who are paying in with lower benefits in the future or no benefits, or until the system collapses like a house of cards. Of course, this article was written or published rather in June of 2023, so the numbers are a little out of date. Of course, the government has the debt has continued to rack up, the national debt, and the politicians have continued to kick the can down the road since June of 2023. Of course, there are things that you can do, and I'm not a financial advisor, but there are things you can do, I think, and I think lots of people my age are starting to think this way, to protect yourself without the expectation of ever getting any of this money that you're paying into the system, because that's a significant possibility. And I think we need to be prepared for that eventuality, that possibility. But this is an example of how the government operates like a criminal, and as they do in other ways, lots of other ways. I've talked about civil asset forfeiture, for instance. Think about how they just print money. I mean, that's basically just making money out of thin air. How is that different than counterfeiting or than just fraud, essentially? But the government does it, so it's okay, and that's essentially what's going on here. So, like I said, I like to share this article. I wanted to share. I had saved. I have a huge backlog of articles to share with you from time to time. Articles that I think are worth sharing, that are worth considering, from great resources, and that I think have some value. Of course, I always want to bring great guest content to you as well, and I think that you'll enjoy some of the guests that I have lined up in the coming weeks. With that said, I hope that if you did like this article, if you did like the podcast, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, share it with your friends and family to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find the podcast on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and all of the most popular podcast streaming platforms. You can also find me on X at Forge of Freedom and at forgeoffreedom.com. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.